Well, happy to be with all of you. Happy to have another opportunity to study in the book of Acts. We're in the last chapter of the book of Acts, in chapter 28. We're down to where Paul is ready to arrive in Italy and make his way to the city of Rome. That's where we left off last time in verse 14, chapter 28. If you'll bow with me for a word of prayer, we'll ask Brother Matt to direct our minds before we start. Okay. So as we left off, last opportunity we had to study together, Paul was on the Isle of Malta, was where the shipwreck happened. And after spending the winter there, they found another ship from Alexandria carrying grain to Rome, and they were able to get their party on board that ship. It sailed up to Syracuse in Sicily, and then they're going to go to Rhenium, and then wait for a favorable wind to pass through the Strait of Messina that is there between Sicily and the toe of Italy, one of the famous straits in the world that ships have to pass through. See on the next slide there, this strait, just a couple of miles wide, that passes between Sicily and the toe of Italy, and there are many whirlpools that are created on either side of this current that flows through there in the Mediterranean, and of course it makes it dangerous sailing back in those days to go through that pass. It's talked about, this strait, in the writings of Homer, where he's talking about Odysseus or Ulysses, and sailing through there, and the monster on one side and the whirlpool on the other, and they gave them the names and the mythical names and so on, talking about this strait here that you're going through. And so you have strong current that flows through there, and wind that blows different directions, very, very tricky sailing back in the ancient world. So they had to choose the right timing to go through there. It says, at the end of the 3 months, we set sail on an Alexandrian ship, which had wintered at the island, and which had the two brothers for its figurehead. It's like, you see those World War II bombers and all the World War II documentaries where they would paint things on the front of the plane and name it different things. They did the same thing in the ancient world. People haven't changed. They had different art pieces and so on the front of the ship or the stern, and different gods and that were hoping to oversee and be and care for the boat, or the ship. And this ship, Luke tells us as an eyewitness about it, that it had the twins of mythology, Castor and Pollux, a couple of sons of Zeus that are talked about in mythology. And when they died, they were, remembered by putting them up in the constellation. Gemini is, you can see that constellation. That's supposed to be the two twins. And the god of the sea also wanted to honor them, so he gave them special blessings over the sea and the wind or different things. So they were ones that sailors would put on their ship a lot of times. And Luke mentions these gods. Probably about February 8th in that area is when the Mediterranean opened back up to where ships could sail again without fear of the terrible weather. And when the west wind started to blow, is what we're told by ancient people, and people that I guess observe the weather nowadays too. And so that was probably about the time they started off for Rome. So you can see what you have to put up with. We have, what a wicked world we live in, and we oftentimes, it's the worst it's ever been. It's what almost every generation you look back in the past, that have written about their days from the times of the ancient Greeks. It's the worst time it's ever been. Young people are the most disrespectful. This is the worst, and so on. And woe is us. But it's been bad. Human beings haven't changed a lot. There's been a lot of opposition and trouble for teaching the truth. It goes back. The immorality and the idolatry and all of the sin and unrighteousness going on in Paul's day was pretty horrible. And here you are, you get on a ship and it's connected with idolatry somewhere or another. I mean, everything you did, there's idols connected with something to do with it. So they were having to deal with that, but through the gospel, they overcame those things, didn't they? In the long run, those kind of things were conquered by the gospel. And so it gives you, at least gives me hope that each new generation that comes along, we teach the truth, and if the gospel's in season, that you can have a big reformation and things can change. Each generation has its opportunities to do good. And just think how Paul and Luke and all of these people, they turned the world upside down, didn't they? That's the way it's described, by even the enemies of the church. And they got this idolatry in their face everywhere they go, but yet they kept plugging away with the truth. Verse 12, and after we put in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. Syracuse was about an 80-mile journey from Malta, about a day's journey if a favorable wind was behind them. And it was a main port in the ancient world for these grain ships to come into and to stay overnight. They stay 3 days there, probably conducting different business and taking on whatever supplies they needed they couldn't get at Malta or whatever. If they have a period waiting maybe for a favorable wind to arise so that they can go on up towards the north. It's some of the things we don't have to think about. We go get in our car and start it and go. But if you're going by wind power, you'd have to calculate all that with everything that you do, I suppose. So they're ready to sail on then to Rhenium. It says, and from there we sailed around and arrived at Rhenium, and a day later a south wind sprang up, and on the second day we came to Puteoli. So they are able to catch the wind just right. Only had to stay there for 1 day, and they get the proper wind to shoot through that narrow pass that's there, and be able to make it the rest of the way. Have there in the notes, the strait is 3 miles wide. Came on the second day. That's 180 miles. So they really make some time with that south wind when they come through that pass and making it on up to Italy. And that Puteoli is one of the deepest harbors for Rome. They didn't have a really good harbor right next to where Rome's at. You had to come in down here in the Bay of Naples. It's still there. Of course, it's still big naval bases and things that are there in that place. And then you go over land to go on up to Rome. And so still, they're not to Rome. They're not to the city of Rome yet, but they're to the big harbor. And if you look at that map there, I think up here Puteoli. Then you got Naples, and you can see Vesuvius, the volcano, and Herculaneum, which was destroyed by the same as Pompeii, by that eruption that happens in 79 AD, not that many years later. It would wipe out that city and Pompeii down there. So, great harbor. They would have seen all kinds of wonderful sights sailing in there if you were, I think about these people migrating from Europe and seeing the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor and all. It would have been something like that in the ancient world, coming into you'd sail past the Isle of Capri. We have songs about that, and all of the mansions, and the rich people went to the Isle of Capri, and had all kinds of things on it. And you'd sail past that, and up there where the big Roman naval base was at Naples, and or all those giant grain ships were being unloaded to feed Rome, coming from Egypt. And it said, the people would spot these ships when they came out, and the whole town would come out to welcome in these big ships that would come in with the grain. So it was a big event. So here, this might be one of the very first ships, since they're all the way on Malta. When they took off, that would be one of the first ones to come in that year, and it would have been a big deal. So I don't know. I try to place myself back there at that time, what it was like to stand out there with Luke and Paul and see the things that they saw. It says, there was found some brethren, and were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and thus we came to Rome. So we come to make our journey there to Rome by coming to Puteoli, and when they get there, there's a church there. So we started off, in the book of Acts, we just had the church in Jerusalem. That was it. That was all there was. And look, it's all over the world, even in Paul's lifetime. Just in the 30 years that he's been preaching, the gospel spread all over the place. And so it's growing and spreading. Even in all of these port cities, there's congregations that are already set up. And Paul stays there for 7 days. Doesn't that sound a lot like what happened at Troas? When he sailed in there, they probably missed the Lord's Supper, so they stayed with the church another week, and then they had the Lord's Supper, and then they went on. So a similar thing happens here at Puteoli. They could meet with the brethren. Shows again, Julius, the centurion, is in charge of all these prisoners and getting Paul to Rome. He seems to be very favorably disposed towards Paul and ready to give Paul whatever he wants or whatever's convenient for him. He saved him out there on the sea. I would hope maybe Julius was a Christian by now. If I had the Apostle Paul with me and I'd been through all the things he'd been through and seen the miracles that he saw, maybe he was a member of the church by this time. He's ready to go take the Lord's Supper too with everybody else. We don't know. It would be nice to find out someday. We want to know the details. So they started that journey back in 27:3, and now they've ended here with all this kindness being shown and ready to go to Rome. That's another way you can translate that. And it's 150 miles more before Paul reaches the goal and the thing that the Lord told him he would do. Any other thoughts on any of this so far? This isn't a sermon. I know it sounds like it. But anybody got any comments to make? Yes, Becky. Thank you.
Well, that of ways, it just amazes me that people don't think things repeat. That, Solomon wrote, there's nothing new under the sun. Right. And, when I have counsel with parents, they'll talk about that, and I say, well, they didn't have that. Like, drugs have been down forever. All these other people don't you just get what good.
One of the things I think about with drugs and stuff is what you read in the late 1800s when they were putting cocaine in Coca-Cola. And they had all these different drugs and people hooked on drugs. We don't even think about people in the 1800s being drug addicts and stuff, but it was true then. So, there's nothing new. There's nothing new as far as human nature, and nothing new under the sun as far as the problems that we run into and face. There's a little bit different form of it, but it's happened before. We're not unique. In looking at Paul's trip here, it says, and the brethren, when they heard about us, came from there as far as the market of Appius and the 3 inns to meet us. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. So, a lot of wonderful things in that verse, that Paul came into Puteoli, and he was there for 7 days. And during that 7 days, there had been brethren went from there up to Rome and told the church at Rome, hey, Paul and Luke, and they've made it. They're on Italian soil. And, well, we got to go out and greet them and bring them into town properly, right? So they're head down about halfway to meet Paul on the way, bring him. I can just see some of the elders and deacons and so on from the churches there in Rome coming down to meet Paul and bring him into town. What would you do if you heard the Apostle Paul was in town? We'd probably load up some vans and stuff and go try to see him too, wouldn't we? And help him and bring him into town. It shows the love. They've been anticipating him since he wrote the book of Romans from Corinth several years before. He told them, I'm coming. That's my plan. And I'm sure there must have been some information exchanged back and forth about Paul's trial and what was going on. Somebody would have carried that news. So anyway, they travel out to the market of Appius. It's 45 miles from Rome. The Three Inns is 33 miles from Rome. These places are still there. The Appian Way, that Roman road, is still there. That if you, it's another one of those trips on my bucket list. Someday I'd like to go walk down the Appius Way and see where Paul, was. They had places for people to spend the night and so on the way on their journey to Rome, and that's where Paul's at. They're meeting him at these strategic locations. I think the Three Inns is where there's a big canal that goes to Rome that you can get on a canal boat, and so there'd be a reason why that's mentioned. It's one of the places that they stop. The brethren meet him there, and I just picture, the scene you had there with prayer and thanksgiving and the greeting that went on. And what does it say about Paul's attitude of mind when it says that he took courage? If you take courage, what does that say you were lacking before? Right? You didn't have as much courage, right? You were down. I can see Paul being down. He's got chains on his hands. He's coming to Rome as a prisoner instead of a free man. And it's not the way he had it pictured, I imagine in his plans when he wrote the book of Romans, that he was going to come to town. And do the brethren, are they going to be ashamed of him, that he's a prisoner? No, they're not ashamed of him. They're eager to see him and welcome him and bring him into town. And he took courage. And it shows how we're able to help each other. You have a preacher here, and you got the brethren, and, it's like putting matches and gasoline together kind of thing. You get Paul there, and they encourage him, and he encourages them, and the gospel's going to explode there in the city of Rome. There's going to be more preaching done because of Paul's attitude and what he's doing in prison. He's converting all his guards. He's doing all this great work, and he's locked up. And that makes all the other people more bold to preach because of that. And so the church is going to grow like crazy because Paul is come as a prisoner. And who would have foreseen that? Who would have thought that would be the way it would work out? And all of the letters we have that we love and treasure are written because Paul's in prison there, and he's got to write letters to encourage people. So think of, we got Ephesians and Colossians and Philippians and Philemon and the book of Hebrews that got written during this period of time. So great things are going to happen because Paul is coming to Rome and getting together with these brethren. He's got more boldness, and they are going to have more boldness to preach. Verse 16, his first arrival then at the city of Rome itself. It says, and when we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldiers who was guarding him. So Paul had some place to stay. Later it's going to mention that he got his own rented quarters. It almost sounds like he had one location to start with, maybe staying at somebody's house, and then later he's able to rent his own place that he's able to have. But again, this courtesy that is shown to him by the Roman officials that he's a Roman citizen, he really shouldn't be condemned. That's what all the letters would say, coming from Festus and from the centurion in Jerusalem and Julius, who was on the ship with him, that this Paul is not guilty of anything, but he's got to see Caesar. So they probably gave him as kind of treatment as possible because of all of the background that's there. And he is allowed to stay in his own place, but he would have had a Roman soldier chained to him the whole time. They weren't going to let anybody get away. We've talked about that several times before in the book, about the strict orders they were under to make sure people didn't escape that were in their custody. But that just gave Paul opportunity to preach to whoever was chained to him that day. I just think about what the things you would hear from Paul if you were sitting in the room with him and guarding him. And then the next shift would change, and another guy would get to come in and hear gospel teaching and preaching. So the whole Praetorian Guard is going to hear about the gospel at this time as they keep changing soldiers. Luke didn't leave Paul there in Rome. And he is with him when he writes the book of Philemon and the book of Colossians. It mentions Luke. The good physician is there with Paul, so he continued to be his companion. Paul was treated with a special courtesy as an uncondemned Roman. Those chains that are mentioned in Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians, Paul talks about his chains. So we know he was still in chains, even though he was in his own place to stay. And any other thoughts? Okay. Yes. Right. And I just think about Paul. I mean, he was the greatest evangelist there's ever been. As far as I know, in converting people. I mean, he did all things. Right. He became all things to all people that he might win some. Every guard that came in, he would, be working on that guy about his background, and he'd be figuring out some way he could get to that guy, right, and get him to listen to the gospel. And of course, that's the mindset we ought to have. Is that we're looking for opportunities, and then we're looking for how can I accommodate myself to this person? They may have a different background or whatever, but what way can I find in common with them that I can approach them and get the gospel to? And so Paul was a master at that. You can just imagine, being with a person like that for a day or two and have him talking to you and working with you. The kind of influence he would have. Here we have Paul's efforts again. Wherever he went, he was under a charge from the Lord to go to the Jews first and also to the Greeks. Right? That's the gospel. It's the plan. So whenever he went into any city, he always went to the synagogue first. He would talk to the Jews first. They were the people that God blessed because of their forefathers, right? And all of the background that they had in God's plan, that they were the ones that had the scriptures from the Old Testament. So they were always the one, according to God's design, you should go to first. So the first people Paul contacts after he gets to Rome is he contacts all the synagogues and tries to get their leaders to come talk to him so he can explain why he's there, why he's a prisoner. And with Paul, it always comes down to how I can preach the gospel, right? That's going to be the bottom line, is he wants to preach the gospel to them too. But he's got a number of things he would want to accomplish with the Jews, since it's the Jews that caused him to be arrested, the leaders back there in Jerusalem. He doesn't know what kind of word has come to Rome ahead of him, maybe, that he's got to straighten out with the Jews so he'd have opportunity to preach to them. If they're prejudiced against him, thinking he's a criminal and he's against the Jewish people and so on, that make it more difficult for his work there. So he's got a lot of reasons to try to call the leaders over to him. And it happened that after 3 days he called together those who were the leading men of the Jews. And when they had come together, he began saying to them, "Brethren, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans." So you would have the elders and leaders of the different synagogues. We're told there were 7 in some of the ancient writings, 7 synagogues of Rome. I have 7 hills and 7 synagogues, I guess. 7. So you'd have maybe leaders from all of those synagogues that would have come. They're going to hear what this Paul, he used to, of course, be the student of Gamaliel and He is a very well-known, influential person around the Roman world, and he asked a hearing for them to come. So some of their principal families would come to hear Paul. I don't know how big these quarters were that he was staying at, but I can picture a full house and him talking to these men and trying to explain to them why he's there. It shows that edict of Claudius. You remember when we were studying in Acts and he met Priscilla and Aquila, and they had been kicked out of Rome because all of the Jews had been kicked out of Rome because of disputes about Christ. They were having arguments about Christ. And the Romans just kicked all the Jews out over that. And so they had come and were working in the tent business there at Corinth when Paul met them. And that edict that Claudius issued is over 10 years old now. So evidently it's gone out of effect, and the Jews have moved back. They're staying in their same locations they stayed before they got exiled out of Rome. So now they've got their synagogues back. So the time passes. There's sort of a lesson in that too. You know, when people panic, oh no, we're all kicked out of Rome. A few years later, they're all back, right? So don't go crazy and think because there's some setback happens that's the end of the church or whatever. Things change, and next year will be different, and the year after that, you don't know what's going to happen. I always think, it's so sad when you hear about people committing suicide. They think it's just, there's no way out. If they just waited a few months, it might have been totally different, That's the way life is. And here they're all back in Rome. They're staying back in their old places that they had before. And Paul is sent for them. And he's trying to address them about the circumstances of his imprisonment so that they don't get the wrong idea that he has come there to try to tear down the Jewish people or attack the Jewish faith or cause the Rome. There's all kinds of anti-Semitism that's going on in the Roman Empire. How many times have we heard that these men being Jews, that's what they said at Philippi, remember? They've come here and caused all this trouble. Well, Paul wants them to know, I'm not here to cause the Jewish people any trouble. But I got arrested in Rome and I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't have any choice. They had a plot to kill me. I couldn't get a fair trial there. I had to appeal to Caesar. I didn't want to come here to cause you people any problems. That's not why I'm here. So it wasn't anything against the Jewish people or the customs of the Jews. So if they've heard anything about Paul causing trouble or riots in Jerusalem or any of that kind of thing or defiling the temple, he wants them to know I didn't do any of that. And it turns out they hadn't heard any of that. So they don't know. Paul probably got there on the first ship after that storm blew him all the way across the Mediterranean. He's ahead of anybody else's ship that probably has a message or a rumor to spread, right? He'd be the first guy in town, nearly. So, verse 18, and when they had examined me, they were willing to release me because there was no grounds for putting me to death. So Paul rehearses all the stuff we've studied about. Felix didn't charge him with anything. He was just going to try him before the Jews. And then same thing with Festus. And they decided if Paul had a trial that they would have had to release him, but he appealed to Caesar. So now he's got to go. And so all of that is rehearsed for the people, and we've got the full account of that. And we know Lysias and Felix and Festus and Agrippa II, they all said he shouldn't be condemned. So he presents all that evidence to the Jewish leaders. But when the Jews objected, I was forced to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had any accusation against my nation. Again, I'm not here to cause trouble for Jewish people. I'm a Jew. He loved the Jewish people. He would give up his salvation, doesn't he say? He said, I could have myself condemned if I could save them. Well, that's how much he loved his people. But, of course, that wasn't possible. So only when I couldn't get a fair trial and there was a plot to kill me that I appealed to Caesar. And you can see how it would be distasteful, just like in the church. We have a dispute in the local church. Paul says that we should be ashamed to go to civil courts to settle problems between brethren. All right? But that brings shame on the church. We don't have enough wise people in the church that can settle some dispute that we would take it to civil court. between two brethren of their members of the church here. And the Jewish people looked at it kind of the same way. They ought to be handled among the Jewish courts. Why is Paul appealing to Caesar? Well, there's special circumstances that caused him to appeal to Caesar. It's one thing when it's just some minor dispute. It's another thing, it's life or death. And that was what it was with Paul, wasn't it? So, again, he's not trying to inflame anybody against the Jewish people. He's trying to establish his own innocence, is why he's there in Rome. Verse 20, for this reason, therefore, I requested to see you and to speak with you, for I am wearing this chain for the sake of the hope of Israel. See that chain is on him right there. I have this chain. I think if that picture was accurate, the chain would go over to a Roman soldier sitting there beside him. That he had that chain. I'm wearing this chain because I believe in the hope of Israel. What's the hope of Israel? That someday a Savior would be born. Right? He would come into the world, the Son of David. He would be the King. He brings salvation to God's people. They've all been waiting on the Messiah. And they would be a ruler that would rule from all over the earth. He'd be the ruler. Right? That's what they've been looking for. Well, Jesus is that ruler. I'm because I announced that and I'm preaching that. That's the reason I'm a prisoner. So you see where Paul makes this transition from talking about himself, and we all need to get more skilled at being able to go from whatever thing we're talking about to, let me tell you about the gospel. What about the gospel? What it has to teach. And so Paul has switched gears here, and now is presenting the gospel to them. And the Jewish leaders have their response then in verse 21. And they said to him, we have neither received letters from Judea concerning you, nor have any of the brethren come here and reported or spoken anything bad about you. So that's encouraging. As much as Paul was worried about this false information being spread about him, they said, nobody's even come here. And you know what? It seems, when we get to the last verse of the book, that they never do show up. That's the reason Paul gets released. And he's able to go and journey and write those other letters of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, that they don't show up. Would you want to show up if you had no evidence? That would have been established. They have no evidence Paul did anything wrong. And what might Caesar do? If he's got the case here and he goes, you don't have any evidence, you've locked this guy up for 5 years, I think we'll just put you to death, right? And that's certainly something they could have done. So I wouldn't have wanted to be the prosecuting guy that went to prosecute Paul. I'd rather stay in Judea and say, well, we'll drop this case, let the Caesar deal with it. So nobody has come there to speak against Paul. And again, he kind of had a head start on all the people anyway. No official charges had come. And Paul may have been on the first ship to get there. But then they respond and say, but we desire to hear from you what your views are. For concerning this sect, it is known to us that it is spoken against everywhere. So, Paul says he's all about the hope of Israel, about Jesus Christ. And they know about Christians. That's been going on for 30 years. They've had this. So we know about this sect. They use a term for just another split off or splitter group, from Judaism. That's what the church is to them. But we would like to hear your views. I'm all for that, wouldn't you? If somebody says, well, we've heard a lot of bad things about you and what you teach, but we're willing to listen. That's all I want. I want people to be willing to listen. And so Paul, I'm certainly going to jump at that chance that he can tell them the full story about why we believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God and the kingdom has been established and all of that. So they call them a sect. A sect is a group of people that's broken off from another group over different distinct doctrines or beliefs. The word we get heresy from is the same Greek word there. It's to choose It's a body of men following their own tenets, a sect, a party. And among the Jews, you have the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Essenes. And then now they think, well, we got Christians. That's another group, another sect. Paul's going to show it's the way. It's not a sect. It's the fulfillment of the Old Testament. That's what the church is. And Christ is. It is about the fulfillment of everything God promised back in the Old Testament time about the kingdom that he was going to set up, a spiritual kingdom that would bring forgiveness of sins and salvation and eternal life. That's what this is all about. But at least these men are fair enough to set up the meeting, and I guess Paul was tactful enough to contribute to that by the way he addressed them and talked to them. And again, it shows, our duty and responsibility. We want to speak the truth to people, but we want to present it in a tactful way so it gets a hearing. So we need to always be careful about the way we speak to each person. Try to study how's the best way to approach that person so we can get them to sit down and hear the whole story. Well, I hear little voices, so I think it's time for us to stop there.